And do please bring them, because it's a real, that's one of the real things that we like to do here, is having dialogue between our audiences and our speakers. Before I get started by introducing Dr. Brooks, I'd like to thank a few people in the audience who have helped make this event possible. I'd like to acknowledge we have a few City College students here who've been helping to volunteer, so thank you to Ina, Ali, Yaobin, Li Juen, and Oscar. I'd also like to thank our staff, Yihang Wu, who is always present and helping, and of course all of the other board members that make this possible. Kurt, who's in the background, Walter over there, David, who will be coming up to close our show out tonight. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce to you all Professor Charlotte Brooks. Dr. Brooks is a professor at the CUNY Grad Center at Baruch College, which is part of the City University of New York system. This is her fourth book, so she is quite prolific. And we're really honored to have her speaking here and telling us a little bit more about the Moys of New York and Shanghai. So without further ado, let's welcome.
Thank you. Is it okay? You can hear me okay in the back. Thanks, Will. I really appreciate the kind introduction. And thanks to everybody for coming. It's really quite overwhelming. In particular, I want to thank many of the family members here. I'm not going to name everybody, but a lot of you contributed your memories, photos, and papers to make this book possible. And, just calling out a few people: Lillian Lee, Chris Moy, Cheryl Moy, Fred Moy, Ming K. Chen, Jolly Young, Alan Chen, Eileen Lee, Isabel Young, and others. There are many of you, so thank you very much. My thanks also to the amazing Helen Zia, who wrote a very powerful foreword to the book, and for which I'm very grateful to have that at the beginning of the book. Thank you. And finally, I want to thank the CHSA for hosting the Moy family reunion today. Also, my talk, but really we know why we're here, it's the Moy family reunion. I've heard that there are between perhaps 30 and 40 Moy descendants today, and that is quite extraordinary. So it's very nice for me to be back at the CHSA. I feel particularly close tied to this place. I started my career about 30 years ago using CHSA collections at Berkeley's Asian American Studies Library, and I'm also a proud member of the CHSA as a member, and on the editorial board of its journal, History and Perspectives. And I have very fond memories of the last time I was here to do a talk, which was in 2015 for a book. It was my second book, and it was called Between Mao and McCarthy. It was a study of Chinese American politics in Cold War San Francisco and New York. And this was actually a research project that introduced me to the Moy family, or specifically Ernest Moy. And so this is actually a photo from the Moys of New York and Shanghai, but I learned about Ernest Moy when I was researching Chinese American politics in New York. And through Ernest, I learned pretty quickly about his brother Herbert, who ended up in Shanghai broadcasting for a Nazi radio station. And this I found this about in 2012, 2013 in some State Department records. And I was really fascinated by it. Why would somebody do this? And so I jokingly called it my side hustle, that although I was working on other books, I was doing research on Herbert Moy. About why he would do this. I just found it a fascinating, choice. And that book, that research was what really laid the groundwork for the Moys of New York and Shanghai. So I'm going to try to give you a little bit of an overview. When Will reached out to me about the plan for today's event, he asked me to start with an overview of the book before we moved on to conversation about it. And I struggled a little bit with how to give an overview of this book, because if you've read it, some of you have read it, some of you haven't yet, but if you've read it, you know it covers a bit of ground, okay? It covers a bit of ground in terms of people, geography, and time. 6 siblings, their spouses, two countries at least, the US and China, over a half century. So I thought, an overview, that is going to be a little difficult without getting really either giant or bogged down in the details. So rather than to try to summarize the book, I want to talk a little bit about what the Moys story represents to me. To me, it's not just a family story, although that's part of what it is. It's the story not just of 6 siblings and their spouses, but I think it's the story of an entire generation. And the very nature of that story is what has rendered this generation almost invisible in some ways. And so here are some photos of the younger Moys siblings, the older ones. I could not find a single photo of all of them together. I always get this question, well, why don't you just put a picture of the book of everybody together? Because I don't know if that picture exists. It may, but it was not something I had access to at the time. And then there are pictures of, at the very bottom one in 1936, is some of the siblings, some of their children, some of their spouses, and the mother Hung Ying. So the Moys siblings were part of the first sizable generation of Chinese American citizens. Not paper sons, but people born on US soil. But the story of this generation has in a lot of ways been overshadowed by the story of their parents. And if you have any knowledge about Chinese American history, and I suspect that if you're here you might know a little bit about this, you know that the story of their parents is really the story of Chinese exclusion. So Congress originally passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, and through the law and subsequent extensions all the way up to 1943, the US government forbade the immigration of Chinese laborers and reaffirmed court bans that prevented all Chinese immigrants from becoming US citizens. Now, exclusion never functioned quite as lawmakers threatened or promised. It failed to keep out all Chinese laborers who continue to find ways to come in, though in much smaller numbers, and in ways that left them very insecure. But US immigration officials also treated the few Chinese who were still allowed to enter, namely merchants, students, and tourists, were treated with suspicion and often contempt. And this is actually a very famous photo, not from the book, very famous photo of an interrogation at Angel Island off of San Francisco. So even the allowed classes, the so-called exempt classes, were treated with tremendous contempt, and there were times when almost none of them could get in. And this is the story we think about when we think about 19th and early 20th century Chinese American history. It's the story of exclusion, its enforcement, the story of the US government barring most Chinese immigrants and trying to make the lives of those already here as miserable and disempowered as possible. And the sources that we think of that document this are, some of them up here, things like accounts from the Rock Springs Massacre in Wyoming, or Golden Spike photo that excluded the Chinese who built the railroad, or coaching papers and transcripts of immigrant interrogations, or the poetry of people imprisoned in Angel Island waiting and waiting in hopes of entering America. We hear much less about the children of these immigrants for a few reasons, I think. I think partly it's because exclusion was a particularly vicious set of policies, targeting and scapegoating one specific group as uniquely undesirable, and so it necessarily commands attention. I think partly we hear less about the children of these immigrants because many who claim to be citizens were actually paper sons, Chinese immigrants trying to evade exclusion. Partly we don't hear as much about the children of these immigrants because the immigrant population, the Chinese immigrant population, was much larger than the citizen population for decades, until about 1940. But I think it's also because of the potency of the myth that in America, immigrant struggles always pay off and lead to better opportunities for immigrants' children. I think we like this myth because it's empowering. It's an empowering story of triumphing over injustice. We like that we can both condemn exclusion and point out the fact that America overcame it. But Chinese American citizens born during exclusion are problematic because their actual experiences so often belie this American mythology of immigrant struggles leading inevitably to second-generation acceptance and success. Not only did exclusion shadow their lives, but the Chinese Americans who stayed in the U.S. Also struggled to escape segregation in the job market, housing, and American society as a whole. This was especially the case before World War II. And the thing is that a lot of people ended up leaving the U.S. I found this out when I did research for my last book, American Exodus. Between the 1910s and 1930s, almost half of the U.S.-born second-generation Chinese Americans moved to China or Hong Kong, hoping to find the kinds of opportunities they didn't get in America. This part of the Chinese American citizen story has in the past been particularly invisible. Again, I suspect because it contradicts a whole array of ideas that are central to the way many people see America. And in that view of that kind of story, neither part of this story was supposed to happen. Not the downward mobility of so many second-generation Chinese Americans in the United States, and especially not the phenomenon of immigrants' children leaving America for better opportunities elsewhere. Yet as a whole, this was the story of the Moys siblings and their generation, and it's not a simple, homogeneous, or straightforward story either. These 6 siblings were born and grew up across an almost 2-decade span. The oldest, Kay, was born in 1893, and the youngest, Herbert, was born in 1911. And they came at age at a time when both China and the United States were changing quickly and in remarkable ways. And those changes shaped how each sibling saw themselves, as well as what their expectations and sense of belonging were. So the older Moys siblings grew up in a country that overtly rejected their basic citizenship rights and the very idea that someone could be Chinese American. And it struck me when I was thinking about my talk today, in 1895, the year Ernest Moy was born and Kay turned 2, immigration officials barred a San Francisco-born Chinese American named Wong Kim Ark from returning to the United States after a visit to China. Wong had to fight this prohibition for 3 years, all the way to the Supreme Court, which in 1898 finally forced the U.S. government to acknowledge that the 14th Amendment clearly guaranteed not just Wong's citizenship, but that of others like him, including Kay and Ernest. By 1905, the year Alice was born and Helen turned 3, a Supreme Court with many of the same judges on it turned around, and in a case involving a man named Ju Toy, gave immigration officials the final power to determine the status of Chinese American citizenship claimants, effectively denying such people access to due process in the courts. The decision was so loathsome and unfair that it helped feed a massive anti-American boycott in an increasingly restive China. 2 years later, Congress passed a law stripping U.S. citizenship from American women who married foreign citizen men, a law that affected Asian American women longer than any other group, and eventually cost Alice, who was really only 2 years old when this law became a law, it cost Alice and several of her friends, such as Lenore Chang, their citizenship. One of the things that struck me is that the older Moys actually remained more idealistic than their younger siblings about both the U.S. and China. They seem to have absorbed both schoolbook rhetoric about freedom and equality in the U.S. and the idealism of China's reformers and revolutionaries. Though they came of age during the years in which arch-nativists in the U.S. attempted to deny their citizenship, they knew that the nativists had lost that battle. They saw and likely remembered what their parents had faced in the 1890s and early 1900s, and economically, there were some opportunities for the older Moy siblings and their spouses in the U.S. or China, even if these opportunities were somewhat circumscribed. The youngest Moys grew up in a different moment, when even those few options were vanishing. While born into an America that recognized their citizenship, however grudgingly, they grew up in one that exchanged the tepid multiculturalism of the 1910s for a new round of violent racial nativism. By the late 1920s, the Depression meant that even the few jobs their parents had access to were disappearing, and though they had far more educational options than their oldest siblings, their post-graduation outlook was far worse. And unlike their brothers and sisters, they could take little comfort in China. When Bill and Herbert, just 23 and 21, arrived in Shanghai in 1932, they found almost no decent work opportunities, while the nationalist government there increasingly rejected people like them with complicated identities and affinities. So what they did instead was they found a very tenuous place in between those two countries, in Shanghai's foreign enclave. But of course, rising tensions with Japan threatened even that tenuous place. So this is really what the book is about. 6 siblings and their spouses struggling to build decent and meaningful lives in one of the 2 countries that claimed them but did not really welcome or value them. And in struggling this way, they represent part of a larger generation that had the unenviable task of trying to forge an identity as Chinese American, an identity that almost no one else, either in the US or China, wanted to acknowledge at that time as legitimate or even possible. Okay, that is the overview.
Let's do that.
Thanks.
There we go. That's the problem. All right, thank you so much, Charlotte, for that introduction to the piece. I wanted to start with kind of a bigger question about the work. One of the things that I find most, that I really enjoy the most about this book was the fact that it's written as a narrative history. And you know, when we go through PhD programs, we're often trained to write history in a way that's very rooted in argument, where you're trying to make an intervention in the field and discuss, and making sure you're working in discussion with other works. And certainly, obviously, this piece is in discussion with lots of other works in Asian American history, but it's one that leads with narrative first. Can you talk a little bit about your decision to write a piece of narrative history as opposed to writing a traditional kind of scholarly manuscripts?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So this book came out of the pandemic for me. I started on a project in 2019, did not get that far, and I'd gone to Hong Kong and done a little tiny bit of research. And then I still have this Herbert Moy article, and some of you who have heard me talk elsewhere know that I tried to write an article, an academic style article about Herbert Moy and his motivations. And I think I have 20 drafts of it on my hard drive. I submitted it to 2 different journals. I workshopped it with friends and colleagues. And every time I did this, I got more comments about how, no, that's not what he did. This is what motivated him. And instead of getting more, I guess you'd say more clarity on this, every time we workshopped it, every round of responses I got less and less clear. And I started calling the Herbert Moy article my white whale. It was just not going to happen, and that was fine, but it was just something I thought was important. And at the back of my mind, I thought, this is just a really fascinating story. And then the pandemic happened, and I couldn't do research on anything else because things were just closed. Research institutions were closed for 2 years. And what I really wanted to do, and I realized this within a week of everything closing and going online, was I thought, if I could do anything, I would just write this as a family story, because I don't think that I can understand this man without understanding his context and his family, and everything I learned about the family members was really fascinating, every single thing. And I would tell my friends, I learned that Bill Moy helped with the first man on the moon? And they would say, after a while, they were just like, of course he did, because this is this family. It's just every new story I learned was just fascinating. But I was afraid to do this, and yet I think it's really important, especially these days when history, the scholarship about history and what we do is increasingly under attack. And it's really hard to make a case to the public of why you should care about these things, and yet they are so vital to who we are as a country, as a people. And I thought, what I really want to do is this kind of history, and I was really afraid to do it. And my wife said, just do it. You know, why are you doing it? And it's like, because I'm an academic, I'm not supposed to do that. I'm supposed to write argument-driven, blah, blah, blah. And then I realized that a lot of people, it was the pandemic, and many of us, weren't sure what was going to happen. I thought, if I survive this, then it's fine. But what I really want to do, I'm going to do what I really want to do, because I think this would be fun and interesting, and the hard part was that I have to find an agent and sell a book, and I'm not good at that kind of thing, but I have good friends who help me do that part, which I really appreciate. And doing this project and writing this way has been one of the highlights of my career. I must say, just really a fun thing to do and engaging, so I really want to do it.
Well, I think as a reader, I really loved it, right? So it's not just that it's not driven by scholarly argument, but you've written it in a way that the chapters are short. They push into each one, and so when you're done, it really reads like a narrative, right? So when you're done with one chapter, you're like, oh, I want to find out what happens, right? Whereas when you're reading a scholarly text, at least when I'm reading a scholarly text, I'm writing all these notes in the margins and about this person, you forgot to mention this person, this argument that's here. And so it's a different type of engagement with story and narrative, which I think is oftentimes missing, and so I really, really appreciated it. Kind of building on that, I'm curious a little bit more. I wanted to talk about, and you mentioned him a little bit. The story that I found most fascinating was the story of Herbert Moy, right? And in a way, his story does push back against some. You don't do this overtly, but it does push back against some of the literature, right? You have, on the back of your book, you've got a quote by K-Stop Wong. K-Stop Wong's, well-known book is American First, right? Which is essentially an argument about how this Chinese-American second generation saw themselves as Americans before anything else. They were extremely loyal, right? But the story of Herbert Moy really, really complicates this and kind of it demonstrates the ways in which the kind of complexities of racism, were negotiated in different ways by different people. So can you tell me a little bit more about how you found out about his story? You mentioned you saw it here, in your earlier book, but how did you find so much detail in his story? It's so descriptive, it's so rich. So talk a little bit more about his story, please.
So it's funny because this whole project started more than a decade ago as an attempt to write an article about him. The book doesn't end up being all that much about him, which is how rich the other stories were. But I do think he is fascinating. And so I ended up finding out about him because when I was doing research about Ernest, I looked a lot at the State Department archives. One of the things that Ernest tried to do, he, in the book talks about this, in 1949 he was working for Claire Chenault's air company, helping evacuate early nationalists from the mainland. He ends up in Hong Kong in 1950. Thanks to Jolly Young, I have 6 years of his diaries, which I've donated to the Museum of Chinese America in New York. But it really is a day-to-day account of his activities. But by 1951, he was living in Washington, D.C. with his son and his daughter-in-law and his granddaughter. And he was lobbying the State Department for funding to help bring Hong Kong Western educated refugees, bit of a flexible term I learned in that case, to resettle in a variety of places. He wanted to do this in Taiwan, maybe in the U.S., and I found State Department memos about him. And I often describe, this is how I think of them, they were bitchy memos. I don't generally use that term, but they were catty like, wow, I want to know more about this, because I love historical gossip because it opens up all kinds of avenues of understanding attitudes and ideas and entrenched bureaucracies in this case. And what really this all seemed to boil down to was a lot of nothing, a lot of allegations, but there was one thing that was true, and it said that Herbert Moy was Ernest Moy's brother. There were also other things that somehow Ernest was related to a man named Eugene Moy. And Moy, obviously I'm telling everybody knows this. Moy is fairly common surname. Eugene Moy was a communist, or not really communist, like maybe pro-communist journalist who published the China Daily News in New York at this time. So he was already under investigation for the FBI. Herbert Moy was associated in the government's mind with fascism. Nobody seemed to have an issue with why these things didn't work. Eugene Moy was also younger than his alleged son, Ernest. I found that fascinating. Like, nobody do math at the FBI? Don't answer that question. But I just wanted to know more. And I found Herbert Moy, well, I've never heard of him, so I looked into it and I found this was true. And I found there was actually a lot of coverage of Herbert's broadcasts, partly in the United States and partly in East Asia and Australia. And that's how I became interested in him. But in terms of the detail, again, I talk about this in the methodology part of the book. I owe a lot to family members who both sat up for interviews and sent me emails, but also shared documentation. And in this case, I relied, from my understanding of Herbert, on a number of things. State Department, yes. American government records, yes. But also the diaries of his nephew, Alson Lee, and Lillian Lee very generously shared, and her son Douglas very generously shared photos of these diaries. And Alson was fairly close to his uncle, and so that when I'm able to document the last days, it's because there are diary entries. They were in Chinese, so it was a lot of reading Alson's very scrawly handwriting. But I described quite in depth the morning that Alice and Alfred learned that Herbert has died, and I based that on the diaries and on the police report from the Shanghai Municipal Archives, which I visited in 2014, and that they were very descriptive, along with the body and everything.
I mean, on that point, I think one of the things that's kind of interesting that you're alluding to, right, is that one of the things that makes this book so enriching is the type of detail that you're able to get from your sources. And I think that I was really fascinated, and certainly the family has an interesting story, a wonderful story, right? But I was almost equally fascinated by the fact that there was so much documentation about this family history, right? Like, I work with lots of families, like, I'm a community historian, and I've seen lots of family photos, but family diaries are something that are very, very hard to come by. And you have multiple people in this family that kept diaries. You've got letters, I think, too, as well. That you wrote, that's just an incredible trove of detail, which I think is not accessible to a lot of people when they're trying to write, let's say, family history.
I was extraordinarily fortunate. I think because this was a family, obviously the deep roots in the U.S., and I think too, luckily people just kept things. Ernest, I document this in the book, but he was, he kept a very detailed record of his days. Not many people do that, but those diaries survived. One of Kay's daughters wrote extensive letters to her husband when they were separated. Her husband was at Peking Medical College, and Kay's daughter Vivian was separated from him because of the war for a few years, and so she documented what was happening she was living with her parents and their everyday lives. But I have to say, a lot of this is just tremendous luck. That these are people who I think had a sense of their importance, the importance of their history. Eugenia Chen actually did an extensive family history in the early 80s when that was sort of something that people were more interested in, and that was useful. And so I kind of think, this is something Scott Wong said. He was one of the reviewers of the book. He said, this is an extraordinary family, but I bet there are actually a lot of families like this. And I think that is the case. And I think there's documentation. I think there's probably more than we think. Some gets thrown out.
about Chinese American history is that, as being a Chinese American historian myself, I found that the most interesting holdings are not in actual archives, but are in family collections, right? And the community has done an incredible job of keeping these alive in their own collections, but because of institutional racism and other things, they haven't often had the opportunity to donate them to places in the same way that white families have, right? And so I think that is something that's definitely true, right? Let's talk a little bit more on that note. How did you? Okay, you told us that you came up with, you found the story of Herbert. How did you meet the family and start multiple people talking to them, interviewing them? Talk a little bit through that process of becoming a researcher about this specific family.
So, it's funny, it did come out of my last book, American Exodus. I had the wonderful good fortune to have that book come out in late 2019. I did one single book talk about it, and then everything closed down. And that, gosh, how fortunate was that? But it was fortunate in a way. So, as part of that, that book is about this generation of Chinese Americans from I started about 1901 to 1940, who emigrated to China for better lives, educational opportunities, better jobs. And in doing that, one of the collections I used were photographs that are at the Museum of Chinese America in New York, and I work with them a lot. And these were actually photos I found later had belonged to Helen Moys, one of the siblings in the Moys of New York and Shanghai. But at the time, I was like, these are people in China, these are some of the people I'm writing about. And it came to me that I knew who they were, and they were not captioned in the MoCA collection because they had been donated by Helen's, it was her brother-in-law's grandson, who, it's a complicated probate thing, but Helen didn't have any descendants beyond her son, who didn't have kids. And so when the son died, there were these photos, and the man who did the estate was a cousin, the relationship, and said, I think MoCA is a great institution, and gave them to MoCA. And so a lot of them were unidentified, and I realized I knew who they were. Oh, that's Kenneth Moy, that is Ernest, and that is Kay, and these were people I had learned about in doing American Exodus. And so I actually wrote to the curator, the archivist, and I said, hey, I can identify some of these that will make it easier for other researchers to use them, and I sent this information. And when they updated those captions, they put my name on, which was not my intention. So it was like, provided by Charlotte, I was like, no. And so when I did my second talk about American Exodus, it was the first Zoom talk I had ever done, back when that was so exciting. Remember that? I was like, oh wow, how great, we're going to do a Zoom talk. And I was like, oh God, I have a Zoom today, and then I can go out and have a life. But about 300 people signed up. It was at the Museum of Chinese America. It was their first Zoom talk. And I was really astounded, I think, because it was a new thing. And down a day or two before, I got an email from somebody who said, I found out about you. You mentioned my family in your book. My name is Douglas Lee, and our family is the Moy family. And I'm going to attend your talk, and some family members are going to attend your talk virtually. And I emailed him, and I had already decided I wanted to do this book, but I know I need to find these family members if they're still around, but I'm not sure how. And I emailed Douglas back, and he's since become a friend, and I said, it's funny that you emailed me, I've been looking for you. And I have an idea, and he was very, very supportive, and Douglas was really the linchpin. He put me in touch with everybody who then put me in touch. He put me in touch with Jolly, who then put me in touch with Isabel, and I am tremendously grateful because people have responded generously and with tremendous interest. And I do want to say, nobody said, don't say this or don't put this in the book, or you can only, I have to have sometimes sayable words in the book. Because as a scholar, you can't say, of course you can have, no, I'm a scholar, but people were just, whatever you find we're interested in seeing what you come up with. So I'm tremendously grateful.
I'm curious as you're kind of describing this. You're meeting all these people, all these family members. They've got stories that you're interviewing them. They've got diaries. They've got journals. You're going to multiple archives. What's your process of keeping track of all this? Because I think scholarly work is always partly about cataloging, but like this is the amount and the variety of sources that you're using to put together the story of like, you know, it's not just the 6 family members, it's their kids, and you know, like it's good that you put this in the beginning, because I mean like, like wait, whose child is that? Like, after you, I kind of get a feel for the main people, but then their kids, you know, like, so how did you keep track of all this and the sources that are going along with that?
I got better over time. I mean, and this is, you know, as you're, you know, as a historian, when you interview people, stories sometimes conflict as well, and you have to kind of make a judgment call or compare documents, and I'm sure that there are maybe things I got wrong too, in that, sort of trying to, you know, balance sources. But in terms of keeping it all straight, I mean, this is actually the good fortune of having done American Exodus, because when I did American Exodus, I cataloged, I had a giant Excel spreadsheet, which, as you know, for a historian is not our natural environment, but I had to go that way, with just little bits of information, name in Chinese, which was really, really helpful. You know, I read Chinese and being able to do being able to get characters of both names is actually much more useful in Chinese because the characters don't change depending on who's writing them. But, you know, I cataloged all kinds of things, birthday, job, when I went to China, and I had 1,100 names on the spreadsheet by the end. So the Moys, that was easy. You know, there were not 1,100 people. But, you know, a lot of it was just trying to keep, in a very basic way, just trying to keep these things straight. And I was very grateful to the press, which was willing to put the resources into a family tree, which was, you know, I think is useful. I couldn't do it beyond a certain point because just the page layout doesn't allow for that. But I've had a number of people reach out to me and say, thank God for the family tree, because I keep forgetting, you know, what the birth order is, or who this is, or what the Chinese names are, or whatever.
Thank you. So, just a few more questions. One of them is so, you know, the book is titled The Moys of New York and Shanghai, and I was so impressed with the detail about Shanghai. Like the everyday description that you kind of came about with that. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, because that's one of the things that I loved about the book, because I felt like having read it, like I had a real feel for what Shanghai was like in the 30s and 40s.
So, you know, it's funny because in the methodology part, I have a sentence where I say, you know, I've lived or worked in or visited almost all the places in the book, and the place I left out was Shanghai, which is the very, how could I've missed that? It was the very first place I visited in China. I've been back numerous times, and I remember in 2014 when I was searching for River Moy, walking around Shanghai, trying to compare what happened to where, the names have changed. So I have long been fascinated with Shanghai, and I think part of what I wanted to do through the book and narrative history was to give readers a sense of that place. And I was fortunate that there are actually a lot of accounts published of Shanghai in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, which I relied upon to give people a sense of place. There are photos, and now there are old movies that people are digitizing. So I was able to benefit from just what would it be like. I have a lot of written accounts, but what do things look like, smell like, and taste like? And I also was able to use some of the letters and some of the diaries and Ernest's diaries, which I got as I was revising my draft, were also quite vivid about Shanghai after the war. And so I'm glad that that came through, because it's a place that I find is infinitely fascinating. And also just, you know, benefited from Helen Zia's book, Last Boat Out of Shanghai, to really, how do you give a really engaging, interesting picture of a place in a few words?
You definitely do that. And of all the places in the book, like that's the one that's like, wow, I felt like I was there, right? So, okay, so I have one other question which ties into my own work. So you and for those who don't know, I write about tourism and film and things like that. You write about the Palais d'Or, if I'm pronouncing it right, this Chinese American chop suey restaurant in New York City in the 1920s. And you know, I've heard of Forbidden City, but Forbidden City in San Francisco, but this is happening in the 30s. And you're describing this restaurant scene in New York City with these Chinese restaurants, with this specific restaurant that's got like live bands, dancing. They're broadcasting radio from the actual restaurant. Can you talk a little bit more? Was this an isolated incident? Was this like a whole scene of restaurants? Do you know how do they develop? Like this seems like it's earlier than I'm thinking of in terms of like chop suey restaurants or Chinese American restaurants like reaching out to mainstream white audiences. So I want to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, this was a surprise to me. It's something I didn't know about when I started the New York research for this, and really went down the rabbit hole with, at the New York Public Library, there's a beautiful research room, pulling out old business directories and guides that have the names of who is on the board of directors, and then going to immigration records about who works at these places, and then finding out as well that you can now read Variety and Billboard, and so reading a lot of Variety, a lot of Billboard, a lot of local newspapers. And what I found out in the overview is that this came out largely of Prohibition. So before Prohibition, which prohibited the sale, manufacture, consumption of alcohol, there were a lot of nightclubs in Times Square. And when Prohibition happened, a lot of them just could not make a go of it, they closed down. And some of them tried to make it go a bit by illicitly selling alcohol, and that was the case with this place called the Palais Royal, which was what the Palais d'Or took over. And it became pretty standard. There were a number of these I discovered in the 20s where a group of Chinese or Chinese American or a combination of partners would basically lease these spaces, and they would prohibit alcohol, they would have dancing, they would have a band, they would have food, and it became really a spot for people to go, for an inexpensive night out. And they were very popular, and there were I read a lot of old guidebooks. And I have to say, I read a lot of stories in Variety and Billboard that were avowedly racist. I mean, these were scathingly so in their description of them. And I'm sure you can imagine how to describe, but there was this sort of dripping disdain for these places because of who ran them and what they served, but they were actually very popular. They were a way for young couples to have a nice night out and feel like they got dressed up and went out dancing. And there were they started in New York, but there are a number of them in Boston, apparently in Milwaukee, Detroit, Chicago also copied. Some of them also had names like Palais. And in the end, what killed them was the Depression and the end of Prohibition, because then, they couldn't make it go with that economic model. But I did find, to my surprise, that really, that I think that Palais d'Or was probably the first restaurant, not the first Chinese restaurant, but the first restaurant to host in New York its own radio show it really made the place, it became famous, and so much so that I found a painting of it by sort of well-known New York artists who also did Grand Central and other sort of icons of 1920s New York in the collection of the New York Historical Society. So it was an important place.
And to be clear, these are restaurants that are catering not primarily to Chinese Americans, but to white Americans, right?
Yeah, they are not catering to Chinese Americans. They are catering, and it's in Times Square, so if you're not from New York, which most of you aren't, that is, you've probably heard of Times Square, but it's also a big transit hub. So the bridge and tunnel crowd coming from the outer boroughs, people from New Jersey, also just tourists from other parts of the country would stay there even at that time. They were catering to the kind of, mainstream anybody.
It's interesting your description there, because you're saying that there's kind of a tension between mainstream audiences loving these places, but maybe not the Variety, not higher up magazine, but like more like elite, like writing about it being very this kind of seeming like it's disdain, right?
Yeah, it's not. I remember one. I think I did quote this in the book. I took out I cut a lot because they don't love it when you submit a 300,000 word manuscript, as you probably know. But I remember this one Variety review calling it. They were called the chop suey and dancing places. There was an actual entry in the guidebook: chop suey and dancing places. And this is in the early 20s, and saying none of them are in the least bit fashionable, but somehow still popular. And it was kind of, not quite elitist, but sort of, looking down the nose.
Last question, were the people that were there more working class? Were they attracting like working class folks, or was it more?
I think it was both working class folks and also just young people who, the city was filled with young people living on their own, or young married couples or young dating couples. It was a place where people could take a date, a man might, take his date, because it was generally that way, take his date and be able to go out and dance without, dropping a lot of money. And Chinese food was popular in New York at that point. It was, even at that early, it was even a decade before.
Well, thank you. So we're going to transition now. We've got about 30 minutes or so, 25 minutes for audience questions. So I'm hoping that folks out there have some questions. So put your thinking caps on. I believe we might have someone who's going to run the mic for us. If you have a question, we have Professor Brooks here to answer it in person.
Thank you. I'm very much looking forward to reading the book, but I have not yet.
Could you speak up a little bit? Sorry.
I'm looking forward to reading the book. I have not yet. But you have a San Francisco Bay Area audience assembled here, and I'm curious if there's any nexus to California history with San Francisco Bay Area history.
Oh, is there a San Francisco angle on that? And yes, and which is nice for me because I'm actually from Northern California originally. So some of the spouses actually, namely Alfred Lee, who eventually married Alice, is from the Bay Area. Part of the story is the moving back and forth over time. And also, I tried to work this in, we talk about narrative history, but trying to make an argument through narrative history that one of the things you encounter is the siblings re-entering the United States, maybe through San Francisco or Seattle, and facing over and over, sort of running the racist immigration gauntlet of interrogations each time, and that was especially difficult on the West Coast. But what I liked about this actually is I've written a lot about San Francisco in my previous books, and it's so central to Chinese American history, as is Hawaii, which makes some appearances here. But I liked being able to pull New York into that story as well, not just because I love living there, I love New York, but also because they are all part of this larger story, and it expands the kind of connections. The Moys came in through San Francisco originally at various times, and that is mostly the story, as well as Alfred's struggle when he returns from China after he comes back in 1949. He had a very comfortable, wealthy life in Shanghai, and he comes back to San Francisco where there is no work for a 50-something-year-old man who was a business success in China, and he finds himself working as a janitor for his brother. He finds himself, I talk a little bit about this, coming back to New York, working at really a chop suey tiki restaurant, right? So that, what does it look like for Chinese Americans in both of these places? How is it different, and how is it depressingly the same, both before and after the war?
And building on that, one of the things that's interesting, it's not just like showing the San Francisco, New York nexus, but the way in which Shanghai gets kind of put within this as a kind of like, they're constantly moving between these places, right, which I love.
Thank you. I'm curious how this book shaped your perception of immigration policy today as it's being replayed with many of these current patterns.
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry, I caught it.
Sure. The question is, I'm curious how this particular book influenced your perception of how immigration policy and patterns are playing out today.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. In terms of how this has shaped my perception of how things are playing out, I probably caught a little bit of that at the beginning. I recently, I'm not sure when it'll be public, but I recently wrote an op-ed for this thing called Make by History, about the way history shapes our understanding of the present, about the attempt to overturn birthright citizenship and the 14th Amendment. And we talk a lot about Wong Kim Ark and that, but I talk about Ernest coming back to the United States in 1950, having gone through this process called pre-investigation, and it pretty much any Chinese American with roots before 1949 can find a file on their family if they went to China, being pre-investigated pre-investigated. You're an American citizen, you have to get pre-investigated to make it possible for you to return to the United States. And I wrote about how, having been pre-investigated twice, he still had to wait something like 9 months to come back from Hong Kong to get his papers, even though there were plenty of files and a birth certificate attesting to his birth in Philadelphia. And so I think in a way, like I definitely have views about our current time, but for me, a lot of this is, I don't agree that history repeats itself, but it definitely rhymes. I think a lot of this is depressingly familiar, and I just keep going back to the idea of him having to get investigated for a third time to establish an American citizenship that was unquestionable, and that this was so much the experience of this generation, that the questioning, the probing, the where are you really from, that there was definitely that echo. Thanks.
Hello, friends of the family. I have read your book quite a way, and I did enjoy it. And part of the reason I really enjoyed it though, is the fact that you had kind of a sweeping historical context. But it also talked like you have, just Sun, Mao, Shanghai, what happened in Shanghai, and colonialism in Shanghai, the collapse of colonialism in Shanghai, coming to the United States, prohibition. I guess my question is, it maybe might be too broad, but my question is, if you talk about five major historical impacts that moved the family, impacted the family. And that might be too large a question, or maybe you want to be selective in the answer, but it was just, I found the book very enriching and very educational for me, to just sort of broad historical perspective of what happened in the United States and in Asia as well. So.
I actually might ask Will to tell me what the question. I have hearing aids, so I've been turning my hearing aid up in the
So what I heard was you wanted the four main kind of like points, like broad historical points that shaped the family's migrations back and forth. Is that what you're saying? 5. Okay, sorry. 5.
Well, 4 I can do, but 5 I'm afraid I Wow, that's an interesting question. So the sort of the big historical moments that shaped the family, or the developments. I mean, Chinese exclusion, and what I read at the beginning was that Chinese exclusion shaped the citizens' experience in different ways than their parents, but definitely shaped it, and even just by distinguishing them as distinct from their friends, from their school friends. I mean, part of what I've written about this book is just the dawning on them. I mean, I talk a little bit about how some of my friends would necessarily have realized that, people talked about Chinese Americans differently than they talked about, he went to a high school that was an immigrant high school. His experience was very different, So I think exclusion is one of them. I actually think a significant one was the mentioned in a lot of scholarship, but the 2 pieces of policy that made it impossible for Chinese American and other Asian American women, if they married a foreign-born man, they would lose their citizenship. And this happened, I mentioned this in the overview, this happened to Alice, but it had a long-term impact too, because Alice remarried to an American citizen after her divorce from her first husband, and that man, Alfred Lee, adopted the son that Alice had with her first husband, but that did not change the son's citizenship status, and he only was able to stay in the United States because of a number of, congressmen took interest, and there was the Displaced Persons Act, but he would have been deported, and they tried to deport him at least twice. There were 2 actions in that. So this had a long-term impact on this family and their security. Being able to just breathe easily, knowing that you at least are in the United States and you're not going to be deported to a country where, there is an instance in the book where he scuffles with some pro-communist students. So I think that one is a long view. Obviously World War II. But II and the Communist Revolution. That's five. But yeah, I think that's the broad overview of the book, and then, I divided it into three, and the war and the revolution are part of that because they were so transformative.
So building on that, one of the things that I hadn't actually heard about in reading your book was, you mentioned, I think it was with Alison, you mentioned how there was an attempt to get like an individual bill. Like, how common was it for like well-off Chinese Americans to get individual bills passed in Congress to gain citizenship? Was this like 5 people? Was it like 100 people? Like, how often did this happen?
All you people want numbers. No, actually, it was individual immigration bills were somewhat common, but Chinese Americans and other Asian Americans had difficulty accessing that level of power.
Yeah.
I mentioned in passing, and this is actually because I was referencing a previous book I wrote, that the real power broker in San Francisco's Chinatown is Albert Chow, and Albert Chow had access to some legislators and could kind of do this for a price, but it was a high price. That said, I think it really speaks to Alice's charisma and charm that basically, with the help of a very young lawyer and pretty much her force of personality, she was able to get a very sympathetic Democratic congressman named Frank Abner. Nobody remembers him now, but he was Chinatown's representative and actually went to bat a number of times in the 40s for Chinese American rights. He sponsored the bill for Alison, and that was not the bill that eventually allowed Alison to stay permanently, but it bought him enough time because it was bottled up in committee, and it's just a series of fortuitous events that the Korean War broke out, and then immigration officials began to say things like, well, maybe a kid who's gone through ROTC in the United States, we shouldn't be sending him back to China, where because the PRC ended the war against the UN and the United States in October of 1950, so maybe this isn't a good idea, and then they got more sympathetic to him over time. But it was a series of, fortunate for him, events that allowed him to stay, and there were actually 2 immigration bills in what were called private bills, one for Alison and one for Peter Kim. And Peter Kim, he was Korean citizen, or he was really Chinese citizen. It's very complicated. But these were unusual, and Pete was able to do this. He was able to get this private bill because a bunch of his white fellow servicemen, officers vouched for him, and he had an officer or 2 who went in there. But it was very hard. Being Asian American, we all do this. That's why what was really so significant were the actual bills passed for larger groups to allow men who had married Chinese women to come in, and that stuff after the war was far more important, but it was also who you had access to. And because very few Chinese Americans in this community, relative to the size of it, were American citizens who could vote because of exclusion, because of all the prohibition on becoming naturalized, only changed that in 1943. It was really hard to say, hey, Congressman, we have this big group of voters.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Hi, thank you so much. My friends brought me here, and so I haven't read the book yet, but I'm super excited to dive into it. My father was born in Shanghai in 1933. He was the oldest of 5 kids, and of course the wars, and they moved to Hong Kong, and he left at 18 to go to South America, to Brazil to study architecture. So I'm just really diving into this, but one thing that was a big theme in my Chinese family was saving face, face and reputation, and there was many, many secrets. And so I wonder how you managed, plowing through all this very personal letters and diaries and things. If you ran into anything that was potentially would be a secret, and how you navigated that. My grandmother, who was born in the early 1900s, had a photo album, and there were faces literally cut out or scratched out of the photo book. Like, you're in, you're out. This person's okay, that person is dead to me. There were all that kind of drama. I think that happens in, I guess, many families, but it was very prominent in my Chinese family that there were people that we didn't talk about. There was an accident where someone died on the way to a wedding. Nobody talked about that sister. And generations later, people found out that they had an aunt that they never knew about. You know, just those kind of things, how you navigated that with the remaining family members. Or like you mentioned that people are very generous, like we want to know everything. But how did you, if you encountered those type of things, how you navigated that?
That's a good question. I mean, I really think that the fact I was able to write this was a tribute to the family members who not only generously shared letters and diaries, but did so without strings attached. I mean, I did find some surprising things at one point. I mean, giving a little bit away, but I found love letters, involving one of the siblings' spouses, and reading them, like, wait a second, like, what is it? Oh, and look at the photo. Oh, but here's the thing. I mean, I think it's a tribute to the family for not putting preconditions, but this is actually one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, because there's tons of amazing scholarship about Chinese Americans in this era. And there hasn't been that much about this Chinese American citizen generation. And I wanted them to be as they were. I didn't want this to be some kind of sanitized, I kind of backpedal a little. When I wrote the proposal for this, I talked about how the understanding of Chinese Americans in this period is often that they were very traditional and conservative. This family belies that, as do many families. And I thought that was one of the most interesting and exciting parts. And I think as historians, we want our people to come alive, yes, but we also want readers to have like this historical empathy, to read about these people and identify with them. And that is what I tried to do with this book. I wanted people to read it and say, I get these people because I know them. And not just I know them through the page, but they remind me of this person or that person. And they reminded me of my grandparents didn't stay married. One of them, definitely not my favorite person. And that, divorce, infidelity, yes, those are parts of life. Bankruptcy, also success. Those are all parts of life. And if we put that on the page, I think our readers will appreciate that much more than if we write as if people in the past were somehow so deeply different, they never had problems, no, that's not how people were, and I really want, I think, as someone who works in this, my field has been Asian American history my whole career. I know people think that's strange, but it is my passion. And what I want is for more people to care about this, identify with it, see it as part of a larger American story. And I think we need to be real with our readers for that to be the case. And I will say that so far, I have had people reach out to me in really positive ways, and even friends I was surprised they actually read the book, because they're not their thing, saying, I'm obsessed with this family. And they all have a favorite, and it's never the same person. I'm obsessed with Alice, or I'm obsessed with Ernest, and it's because I think they realize these are real people, and that I really am glad.
Thank you.
Well, that answered my question. Because I also write the history of Asian Americans, particularly Chinese Americans, and trying to, really talk about their struggles, but their successes, what they've contributed, and make them real. But I don't know, I also wrote the play of the Chinese in Chicago, real. But I don't know how successful that will be. Like, how do you get them out there so that it actually begins to make a difference?
That's a big question. I mean, you know, I said that I started writing this during the pandemic, and part of the reason was that I felt tremendously angry and frustrated and disempowered about the situation, the attacks on Asian Americans. And although I could, you know, march, which I did, and donate money, and, you know, I thought, I feel powerless to do anything. It's so angry. People are attacking, you know, just, it's frightening. And I thought, the one thing I can do, I don't know if it'll be successful. I mean, we just have to try everything, but the one thing I can do is this. This is something I wanted to do, but I also thought like the one thing I can do is what I know best, which is to write history that brings these people to life and shows that they are part of this larger story. And, you know, I mean, there are people who can do other things much better, and there are people who do this much better, but this, you know, you contribute the way you can, and that is my hope. Again, we have to have, I would often say I'm not optimistic, but I have hope, because, you know, we want to fight for the better world that we want to live in. You have to have some hope, or it's not worth fighting.
Yeah, hope is resistance, and storytelling is resistance.
So I have two questions that we're going to take from the audience that were written down, so I'm going to ask you both of them. So the first one is, can you tell us what the current state of local history is in China? So what's the local history scene like in China? Are people writing local history? Do you know anything about that?
Oh, I don't know as much as I would like to. I know it through friends, so one of the nice things I've been able to be involved in a little bit is this group called the American History Research Association of China, which is a lot, it's actually, I know more about like people doing research on what would be called overseas Chinese. And a lot of people I know who are Chinese scholars are in this group, and some have come to the US and done research, and I've got to know them that way. It's hard to do that kind of research. You know, there is, one of the things that dismayed me over the last few years is that I did some of the research for this in the Shanghai Municipal Archive, and even just trying to get access to certain files for a government that no longer exists in a time period that has no impact really on the president was really difficult. If I wanted to do any copies of the digitized files, I mean, you know, the rigmarole, you have to apply, they have to review them, you can only photo or print out a third of a file, and they need a week to review these things. And then I was just like, okay, you know, I'll write down what I can. Unfortunately, the unvarnished exploration of the past is not something that the government prioritizes here nor there. But I think people are doing that work, and interestingly, one of my friends, Moys, traveled down to Toisan a few years ago after the pandemic, and he sent me some pictures of just collectors who had collected photos and letters of overseas Chinese, as they're called, and Toisan. You know, people are doing it, they're collecting, but, you know, the actual, what do we do with these kinds of local collections and works, where do they remain, how accessible they are, is much cloudier. So that's kind of the vague idea, answer, you know, it's hard. It's a big country, you may know this. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because when you think about, like, I know in the United States, there's been a kind of like surge in people doing Chinese American genealogy, right? So there's like Chinese American genealogy groups, I think like Ancestry.com and all that type of stuff has made it so much easier. So it's sounding like because of government control in China, that there's not like people collect, but there's not the same type of like.
There's definitely, you know, the curated tours of the village, and you get that for sure. You know, the village ancestral hall, whatever. But I tend, I mean, as you can see from reading this book, if you look at the notes or you look at the methodology, that's not what I think is the best material, right? The stuff that people want, not even what you see, but like the stuff that's the official record, there's
Chinese American and Chinese history?
I don't know, actually. I know that I have friends who do it, but, it's.
Yeah.
Yeah, I heard, really. I'm not sure.
Not trying to put you on the spot, but what's happening in Chinese historiography? So, last question here. Is there an interest in China to translate and distribute your book?
I guess it kind of depends on who you ask. Maybe. But, my last book, which came out in 2019, has never been translated. So, I think partly, if you write a book called Between Now and McCarthy, maybe that's why I'm for it, right?
All right, so I think David's going to come up and say something.
Yes, are we done? You have it, okay. Yes, this is the first time I'm doing this. We don't have honorarium to our speaker, and right before the event, I was told we have a book. This one's by Beth Lou Williams from Princeton. It's called Joel Chinaman. It's very good. I'm not sure if you already have this. If you have, we have a bookstore that you can carry for others. Now, as a Chinese American or with a Chinese background, we don't give things like clocks because it sounds the same as to see someone off their last minute before they die. We don't give umbrellas, we don't give pears because it means separate. And for Cantonese, we don't give books because the word for book is su, to lose. But there's ways around it, so you can pick 5 books because that's su, or 5 books, and su, never lose. But to save some money, I have a pen. So, but su, not to lose. I'll give you this. You can go into a bookstore and pick others if you want, up to 5. Then I want to introduce some people in the audience. Part of the reason why we have these talks is all you folks must be nuts about Chinese American history to come here for something like this. So as a community, we're trying to form here at CHSA. We've been around 63 years, and we do have oral history. Actually, in California, it started with Hubert Howe Bancroft. In the 1850s, we started doing oral history. For Chinese Americans, William Hoy. A few of us know William Hoy. I would say he's the first Chinese American historian before Himart Lai. Himart Lai used William's writing to continue that. William Hoy died in 1949. He did oral history with H.K. Wong in the 1930s, and we have them here. And we're continuing this tradition. In about 2 months, we will have our oral history room downstairs. You can turn on the cameras. We have cameras that points at you, at the documents you want to show, and leave it for your grandchildren, or your children, or for the world. And we're going to transcribe them today with AI, and so we can do a lot more with these oral history very inexpensively. We just want a copy of your stories to start collecting these. And one of the things I want to talk about is the audience. We have so much knowledge in this room. I want to mention a few, and I can't read my own handwriting. I have Helen Zia back there, a real historian, writes a lot of books. And Detroit, she started the second Asian American movement. Really been important, so give a chance, talk to her, introduce yourself. Robert Lee, are you still around or you left? Bob Lee. He might still be around. He was sitting here. He is a psychiatrist. Today, psychiatry, mental health for Asian Americans is a huge topic because most Asians, we don't go for that. If he's still here later, chat with him. Douglas Shah, who's the co-founder of the American Heritage Network, 18 Northern California historical societies and sites. He put us all together, talked to him about all 18, and if you have a site that has not joined, talk to Douglas. Next to him is Keon Chan. Keon, into the law, he was working with Dale Manami from day one. So if you want to know about the law of Keon, and Keon's wife just published a book on sojourning in Gold Mountain. That exhibition is closing in Hong Kong. We hope to bring it here. Cindy Westbrook. Cindy, you still here?
Yeah.
Yeah, right here. The reason why we have Charlotte is Cindy and her husband Wayne contacted me, and we put Charlotte on our calendar. But Cindy and I, we go back to the 1970s. She's been in every Chinese New Year's parade since 1970. So you want to know about the Chinese New Year's parade, talk to Cindy. And Willard's here. Our next event, Willard was the president of Chinese Historical Society. Our next event is July 12th. We're showing a film documentary about Chinese in Napa with Mike McCormick, who wrote the book. So that's our next big event. Put it on your calendar. Then I'm our Vanetta and Kim here from California Press, University of California Press. They published this book by Charlotte, and if you have aspiration of publishing a book, these are the two people you should talk with. They're local. And I want to introduce Walter, our co-president. So if you're inspired and want to support this organization, Walter's always looking for money. Take out your checkbook, talk to Walter. Right now we have food, very good food, that's included in this. So get some food and stay, talk with Charlotte and the other people I introduced. Introduce yourselves. This is what we're about, trying to build a family around Chinese American history. Thank you very much.
That concludes our presentation. So thank you, Charlotte, again.
Our family also has the Shanghai, Hong Kong, Brazil.
No way.
Yes.
Wow.
Well, okay, our family, my father and his brother, they lived in Sao Paulo in about late 1950s.
Yeah, that's when my dad was born in 33.
Yeah.
So he came when he was like 20. So like early 50s.
And I think the people I had contact with They were the family. They had a very big chicken farming operation in Porto Alegre.
Well, Legacy's for my mother's family, so I'm mixed. My mother's Jewish, and her family is the turn of the century, running away from Bolsheviks, pre-Holocaust, and they went to Porto Alegre in the south.
Okay, but then you don't know this chicken.
No, probably, maybe yes, maybe no. I can find out because I have tons of Jewish cousins in Porto Alegre.
Okay.
But you have Chinese Porto Alegre.
Yeah, of course they're Chinese.
That's amazing. That's crazy.
Because I went to Porto Alegre in the year 2000 something.
Okay.
And they had the family was very prominent. And it's like a mentor to all the Chinese families.
Okay, I have to call my cousins tonight. I'm going to call them in Porto Alegre. What year were you born?
Okay, I was from 1957 in Hong Kong. I came to Brazil. I left Sao Paulo when I was 6 months old. And I left Sao Paulo when I was 2. Back to Hong Kong.
Back to Hong Kong. So where did your parents end up?
Hong Kong.
Hong Kong. So they went back. They went to Hong Kong. You know, my father wrote a memoir. It's very funny. It's not funny, but he's very living in mid-70s.
Uh-huh.